The Chicago Bears offense was far from a finished product in Ben Johnson's first season, but he's taking a really smart approach to how he wants to build off of that and maintain continuity into year two.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. On the show today, we're going to hear from Bears head coach Ben Johnson about, what kind of progress this Bears offense made in their first season, where they still have a lot of room to grow, and how he's approaching taking everything they did successfully in year one and trying to build off of that in year two, while also taking some time to reset, reevaluate, and not just try and pick up exactly where they left off, but also kind of getting back to some of the basics throughout that process. We'll also take a look at how this Bears defensive continuity could be at risk or in jeopardy as defensive backs coach Al Harris starts getting some significant defensive coordinator interviews from other teams, including, unfortunately, the Green Bay Packers. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network. And Ben Johnson knows that this Bears offense still has a long way to go, but they simultaneously did a lot of really good things and made a lot of progress this season. Like, it can both be true that there was a lot to like from the offense this year, and also so many ways where they can get better, and you feel like they, I don't want to say underwhelmed, but just, left a lot to be desired at times. Like, we saw plenty of games where the first three quarters were not what you wanted them to be, and then the fourth quarter is above and beyond. And man, if you could just get this group to be a little bit more consistent from start to finish, you'd have yourself something that's really, really dangerous. And there's plenty of games where they start slow and takes them a while to get things rolling, but there are also those stretches where it looked like everything it was supposed to. I think about, like the Bengals game when they're scoring at will, and against the Eagles when things are going their way, and the Browns and the 49ers, right? We've seen moments of this offense looking like it's supposed to, and now it's about being able to do that much more and trying to avoid the droughts and the slow starts and stuff. Like, at the end of the day, this offense still ended up 9th in points allowed or points scored this season and 6th in yards accumulated this season. So, like, they were literally a top 10 offense in football. And yet, as Ben Johnson himself said at his end of season press conference on Wednesday, he sees them really just scratching the surface with a lot they can get better at now entering his second offseason at the helm, where everyone now has a little bit more familiarity and knows where they're working from to really refine it and make it that much better.
And from your seat, what's the significance of the offensive continuity that you seem to have in place going into 2026? Players, plays, all the things that carry forward from here.
Yeah. I mean, I think back at this year, and we made a number of strides. Okay, and Ryan did a phenomenal job acquiring talent, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. Up front, this offensive line, I feel like we got something to really build upon there. We've got weapons on the perimeter. Our quarterback's going to be a special player in this league. I think it starts there. Our running game picked up as the year went on, which I think is desperately needed, particularly we get these home games late in the year. It's a huge part of what we do and what we're about. And so with that being said, I think we did a number of really good things on offense, and yet we haven't even scratched the surface of what we're fully capable of yet. And so we'll talk about that. We'll address that as a coaching staff. How can we get better? I think it always starts with me as the offensive play caller. There's some areas I need to shore up. The weekly process that we had, it always starts there. But I think our guys are going to be a lot further along when they come back in the springtime. And like you mentioned, we got a core group of guys on that side of the ball that should be able to have some familiarity.
What I love about Ben Johnson's approach there is how, once again, like, it's accountability, and it starts with me being Ben Johnson, right? Like, okay, the offense has to get better, and that starts with me. There's areas I have to shore up, areas I need to keep working harder and improving, but knowing that, guys will be farther along, so that's what he can, then he can start advancing even more on his end. Like, it's easy to sit there and say, well, I'm the offensive guru. I'm Ben Johnson. I know what perfect offense is. I am the expert here, and the players are the ones who are learning from me, but I have already mastered this, right? Or, like, he is the offensive architect. He wrote the book. So what you could see where ego of other people in his position might say, well, I don't have to change anything. I don't have to keep working at it. I don't have to improve. Like, I've already got it all figured out. I just have to help them get closer to my level. But Ben says, no, wait a minute. I can be better. It starts with me. I'm going to be working just as hard to improve as I expect the players to work and improve. And it brings him, I don't say brings him down to their level, it brings them up to his level. It brings them to the same level of like, yes, we are all working in this together and we all have areas to improve. And so when he demands a lot from the players, they know he is demanding just as much, if not more, from himself. While also acknowledging in that process that, like, hey, they have done a lot good and they have gotten good and better players and feeling really set. Like, I think he talked, I think you hear a lot about in his words there of like, don't expect him to change up the offensive personnel too much this offseason, right? He talked about the offensive line being set, about having the weapons, obviously the quarterback he believes in, how the running game got settled in, right? It's not like Ben Johnson's going to go in this offseason saying, oh, we got to you got to get a whole new backfield and got to get a new left tackle and got to get get DJ Moore out of here and get some receivers in. Like, I think he feels pretty comfortable with most of where the offensive side of the ball is. I know there are some guys on offense that are, more like depth players that are free agents, a couple of the backup receivers, a couple of the backup offensive linemen, and a couple of, could see some changes in the bottom of the running back depth chart, but like, I expect mostly stability and just a few tweaks here or there on offense. So then you've got a bunch of guys who've all been in the system before, right? Like, every new player you bring in from the outside is going to be a year behind everybody else in terms of knowing the playbook, knowing the adjustments, knowing the precise timing, and knowing when and how the quarterback is going to throw the ball with the kind of velocity that Caleb Williams throws on it. Doesn't mean you should avoid adding outside players. It's just to say that, hey, there's a real value to the guys who have been here before. I imagine, yeah, we'll see a couple of receivers here and there with Zacchaeus and Duvernay are both free agents. So, like, yeah, they might be numbers 5 and 6 in the depth chart, but you got to fill them with somebody, and whether it's them or them brought back or other players, like, we'll see little bits of movement there. Same thing, backup interior offensive lineman Ryan Bates, Jordan McFadden are set to be free agents. Like, there'll be some little wiggle room there, but for the most part, I think you're going to see them just kind of take the same offensive players from last year and have them all be a year more experienced, both as players but also within the system, and feel like, boy, that can accelerate a lot of what you want to do on offense this year in terms of installing and stuff. But the other caveat here from Ben Johnson that I really like is that he's not just going to say, all right, like, we got this far this year, and so next year we're going to start from there and keep building up from there and assume that everything you've already learned, everything you've already done, that's got to be set, right? That's already good to go. They already know that. Not so fast. Ben Johnson is in no way just going to pick up this spring where they left off this winter. They're going to do some tearing back down and getting back to basics. I think that's really smart. So we'll hear from Ben Johnson about how and why they're not going to just ride the momentum from this past season, but they're going to hit the reset button and kind of start back from square one this offseason. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Robinhood. What if sports were traded like markets? Well, now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house. It's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long and use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets change the game because it's people moving the action. So when momentum shifts, you can move with it. You've always known the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. But now you can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood. Now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. The Locked On Bears podcast is also brought to you by Gametime. We're in the heat of the NFL playoffs, and there's nothing like being at the game. The crowd noise, the energy, the cheering alongside other fans. Watching games at home is great, but being in the stadium hits different. And the frustrating part's always been getting tickets, waiting in the queues, dealing with logins, and watching prices change right at checkout. But that's why the Gametime app gives the advantage back to fans, because it's the hack for unlocking amazing NFL tickets and experiences in just a few taps. Not just the NFL, though, but any sport: basketball, soccer, tennis, hockey, boxing, comedy shows, theater events, concerts. I've used the Gametime app for all of them, including Bears games, and I really like that the fees are all included up front. So the price you see is exactly the price you pay, and the tickets are backed by the Gametime guarantee that gives you real peace of mind that you're not overspending. So take the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today and get back to being there live. The Bears absolutely made real progress in the 2025 season that will help the offense jump up to the next level in 2026. But I do think it would be foolish to just assume everything they did and learned in 2025 is therefore totally mastered. You know, it might have been Ben Johnson offense 101, but okay, they passed that class, so then that's totally mastered. They're perfectly experts in whatever 101 is, and now you can move all the way on to 201 starting this upcoming offseason. And you absolutely will move on to 201 or whatever, the next iteration of the Ben Johnson offensive class is here. But I think it's really important that Ben Johnson sees the bigger picture here and says, yes, we went through all of that, but let's not just assume that's mastered. Let's start over and go back through all of that before we then advance to the new stuff. Knowing that the second time you go back through all that stuff, like a year later, that should go a lot faster because they do pretty much already know it, but you sort of refine, refresh, reinforce everything they had already learned to now make sure that they really do have that mastered before you move on to the next stuff, instead of assuming, well, you passed that last class, so you know all that stuff, so let's assume you have all the knowledge down pat, because we saw even in the Rams playoff game, miscommunications and not everybody having things down pat. So here's how Ben Johnson talked about essentially starting from square one and getting back to the fundamentals and why it's the smart thing to do.
You said there's a lot of work to do. It's going to be more difficult. Besides Caleb, what gives you confidence that you guys are going to be able to build off this and that they're
there is no building off of this. We go back to square one. We're back at the bottom again, and that's really all 32 teams. If you feel otherwise, you're probably missing the big picture. You know, we're back at. We got to start from scratch. We got to start from the fundamentals. You know, a lot of guys talked about how difficult this training camp was. I didn't feel like it was anything out of my ordinary. They know what the expectation is. They know what the process is that we believe in as a coaching staff. And so I think more than anything else, they're going to know what they're getting themselves into. And yet we got to dig a little bit deeper. We got to work a little bit harder. We got to give a little bit more if we want to take this thing over the top. I mean, it's no different. You're trying to lose weight. You're trying to lose 50 pounds. The first 30 is the easiest 30. You know, the last 20, that's the hard part. And so we did a nice job this year, but it's not enough. We got to do more.
I think that's a perspective that not every first-year head coach has when they come into the position. And I think it's something that perhaps, you know, to draw a comparison here, was lacking in 2018 when Matt Nagy had a really strong first season, you know, won 12 games, won the NFC North, home playoff game, etc. Like, yeah, sounds a little familiar, right? But like, it felt like back then they kind of tried to just ride that ship and say, all right, like we just did that. Let's let's keep it full steam ahead. Just pick up right where you were, and you lose Vic Fangio and stuff along the way, and you try and just plug and play replacements and say, well, you just fill that hole, and we'll just kind of be the 2018 Bears again, but in 2019, right? And then of course it doesn't go that way, right? And this is a fundamental understanding of no, we kind of got to tear this back down and build it back up, knowing that we've built it before will make it really easy. But then once we build it the second time, we'll really truly have a better understanding of how it's built. We built it the first time, but you kind of had to rush through it a little bit and just get the thing built. But now that you're building it a second time, it should go a little bit faster. And then you can add on to it now that you've built it up and know how you can keep building it up there, right? Like, and I think I like the way he talks about how like everyone's talking about training camp being hard. That wasn't hard. That's gonna be normal. And like now guys know what they're getting into, and now that they know what they're getting into, they got to work even harder and dig even deeper. Like last year, it's like you're working hard because you don't really know what to expect, and you got to just try and get by and figure it out. Now you know what training camp's going to be like. You know what OTAs are going to be like. You know how and where and when they're going to throw stuff at you, so you can be more ready for it this season. So maybe it won't feel in the moment immediately as difficult, at least to go back through the stuff you've already done. And then they're going to add the next iterations of that on top of it, right? Like I think that's such a smart, wise, and important approach to not take for granted that success is really, really hard, and not take for granted that just because you were successful in 2025 doesn't automatically grant you success in 2026. And I think Ben Johnson is smart enough to look over at his former team in Detroit and say, hey, you know what? They couldn't just pick up exactly where they had left off the previous season. Or you look at the Washington Commanders with Jaden Daniels and Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury, right? Couldn't just pick up exactly where you were the previous season. And you can't just go in this offseason saying, well, we're the reigning NFC North champs, so, we've already got this figured out. We just got to keep doing what we were doing, and, everything's going to keep going our way. It's like, no, your record is 0-0. Like, so is the Packers record, so is the Lions record, so is the Vikings record. Like, everybody, you're starting from the ground floor, from the baseline, and you got to re-earn every win, and you got to re-earn that division title. Like, you don't really get to keep it in the offseason. I mean, no one's going to take it away, right? But you're not starting week 1 next year as the NFC North champions. You're starting out tied for first place and tied for last place, right at the same time. So to be able to sort of put that behind you right away, like you still appreciate it, right? And we talked about it in the first segment, right? Like you see the progress and you've made a bunch of strides. You're not saying, oh, everyone's an idiot now and we're still, we're never going to be any better. But you have to start really like reinforce those fundamentals every single time to make sure that they stand, especially when those types of fundamentals were some of the problems that we saw this offense have all season, right? Dropped passes was something Ben Johnson talked about in a different clip that we're not going to play here, but I think that's one of the big emphases that he's putting on this offseason is we got to hold on to the passes, especially when Caleb Williams throws them 100 miles an hour. Like receivers are expected to hold on to passes, and the fundamentals of route running, right? Like it's supposed to be a basic thing that on a specific route, you're supposed to run to a very specific depth on the field, then break at a very specific direction and end up at a very specific place, right? Like there's not always or not usually much wiggle room there. Like you and the quarterback are supposed to think and expect the same thing and know that you're going to be in the same spot that both of you think you're going to be, right? Like, and that kind of stuff wasn't mastered through the first season. And I'll throw penalties in there in terms of fundamentals, right? Like snap count, false starts, right? Holding, any little penalty tends to be either a mental error or like a technique issue. You grab onto his pads when you're not supposed to, you hit his face mask when you're not supposed to, right? Like those are all more in the bucket of fundamentals. And so while they got to a certain passing level of fundamentals at times, like absolutely got to be better. It's not just like lip service of like every coach talks about fundamentals, right? Like, okay, yeah, we get it. But like for the Bears, it's a very real, like, no, you do got to be better at fundamentals. Like you could see a veteran player kind of rolling his eyes and saying, Coach, I'm in my 30s. I've been in the NFL for 10 years. What do you mean I got to work on fundamentals? But he can point to it and say, here's the pass you dropped. Here's the penalty you made. Here's the tackle you missed. Like whatever it's going to be. No, you and everyone on this roster actually do have to start and work on fundamentals. And it will be less work, perhaps, fundamentals It'll take less time and less work this time around than it did last year, but it's going to be just as important to reinforce those before you can get on to, whatever the next future iterations of the Ben Johnson offense are going to be. And plus, you do got to change stuff every offseason too, right? You can't keep the exact same plays and call them the exact same things, or else teams are going to know, oh, we already kind of know your tendencies and the plays you run. You got to come up with new stuff every single offseason to stay one step ahead. And he clearly recognizes that as one of the big challenges towards, taking the continuity you have and building off of that in 2026. It's going to be a challenge for the defense to build off of some of that same continuity if, and perhaps at this point, when you lose defensive backs coach Al Harris. He's getting a ton of attention for NFL defensive coordinator openings. So we'll take a look at where that interest is coming from, how important he was to this Bears defense, and go through some potential spitball and some names that would make for encouraging replacements with connections to this coaching staff. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Indeed. If you've ever hired someone who looked good on paper but wasn't the right fit, you know how important that is. When you want candidates who truly match what you're looking for, trust Indeed sponsored jobs. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your post seen on other sites because Indeed's sponsored jobs puts your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all of your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves. If you go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. That's Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL to get your sponsored job credit and show some support for this show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. The Locked On Bears podcast is also brought to you by TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. This year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax Full Service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert start to finish without the stress or the guesswork. So instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They'll handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and work to get you every deduction. It's a huge time saver, and it gives real peace of mind knowing that an expert is handling it. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off of your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. This Bears coaching staff is going to lose some respected coaches as other teams want a piece of the action and say, oh, that guy's been really good for you. Well, we want him on our coaching staff and we're going to give him a promotion in order to land him. We already have seen now officially Eric Bieniemy is headed to the Kansas City Chiefs to be their offensive coordinator. We talked about that on yesterday's podcast, or maybe it was 2 days ago, or earlier this week. We talked about how important Eric Bieniemy was to the Bears running game and also some potential names that would make sense to replace him. And now we're facing a similar dynamic, although not official or anything, with defensive backs coach and defensive passing game coordinator Al Harris, who has gotten a lot of credit for the number of interceptions this secondary has generated this season, deserves plenty of credit for how Nashawn Wright emerged as a playmaker on this defense and how this secondary hung on through injuries to Jalen Johnson and Kyler Gordon that had a bunch of backups out there and didn't completely implode, and found ways to plug in C.J. Gardner-Johnson off the street and get some decent play out of him. And all sorts of rotating in the cornerback position. Al Harris deserves a ton of credit for what this secondary was able to do in spite of all the challenges. And that's why the Green Bay Packers interviewed Al Harris, I think on Wednesday was when the interview actually happened. And that sure scares the heck out of you, right? If he has to leave, okay, maybe you can survive, but you sure as heck don't want to play him twice a year up in Green Bay. Like, that would suck. If he could get this Packers defense starting to generate turnovers to the degree that the Bears defense has been generating turnovers, that would be a problem and not something you would want to see. Now, the Packers are interviewing a bunch of different coaches and a bunch of different defensive backs coaches specifically. So, it's not to say that Al Harris is a shoo-in or the favorite even necessarily for that job, but he is a former Packers player, and I believe he's in the Green Bay Packers Hall of Fame as well. So if there's a team that, he might be most interested in or more interested than others, it's probably Green Bay. But then on the same day that the Green Bay interview was reported, I can't remember who the report, Jeremy Fowler of ESPN reported then that Al Harris will be interviewing for the vacant defensive coordinator job with the Washington Commanders as well. That one feels a little bit less enticing, I guess, just insofar as you have a defensive head coach there in Dan Quinn. And it's true that, Dan Quinn could, give him the defensive play calling responsibilities and it would still be a good job for Al Harris. Certainly a defensive coordinator position is always going to be a promotion from the assistant coach job he's in. But he could feel a little bit overshadowed there, that it's always going to be Dan Quinn's defense, even if Al Harris is the defensive coordinator there. But I certainly don't blame him taking an interview with a spot that could be a very successful team next season and could be a playoff team, a division winning, the Commanders, if they're healthy at quarterback and stuff, people expect them to continue to be a contender for the foreseeable future. But Green Bay is the one that worries you a lot. He's been also linked as a possible candidate for the Dallas Cowboys defensive coordinator job, but I haven't seen, at least at the time of this recording on Wednesday night, any reporting that Harris is going to interview with Dallas, but certainly he'll be in the mix there. And even if the Packers hire somebody else and the Commanders hire somebody else for their coordinator jobs, there's still a bunch of teams that have head coaching vacancies. So depending on who, the Buffalo Bills hire to be their head coach, they could potentially try and bring Al Harris with them, right? Or, whoever ends up with the Baltimore Ravens or the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, there's a bunch of teams, the Cleveland Browns, like any of these teams could look at Al Harris as a defensive coordinator. So even if it's not the Packers or the Commanders, you're not going to be in the clear yet until every defensive coordinator job is filled. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about how much of a loss it would be for Al Harris to not be on this team, but we know it's coming eventually. If it's not now this offseason, it could be next offseason. I mean, it's only a matter of time. You hope you get one more year with him, but in all likelihood, he is a fast rising coach who's going to get a lot of interest and probably going to get a job from somebody here in the next couple of weeks here. So then if Al Harris leaves, what are the Bears' options to replace him? I think they have some in-house names to keep an eye on, and I think there's some guys with some real experience that are from other teams that also would make a lot of sense, that have connections to this Bears coaching staff. So when you look at the current Bears defensive lineup, for example, Al Harris is defensive backs coach and passing game coordinator. They have a couple of other guys on the roster that might make some, on the team that would make sense. They have a defensive assistant coach who his position title is coaching the nickel corners, the slot guys, Kyler Gordon, CJ Gardner-Johnson, Josh Blackwell. His name is Cannon Matthews. You could see, okay, if you've been coaching the nickel corners, could you just promote a young coach? This was his first season with the Bears, and he might be a little green to promote all the way up to defensive backs coach. But he's been coaching in the NFL for a handful of seasons. He was with Al Harris in Dallas as a defensive quality control coach, and then eventually assistant defensive backs coach. So he was kind of his right-hand man in Dallas. It's possible, I guess, if Al Harris gets a DC job, he could bring Cannon Matthews with him to his new team, or the Bears could try and promote him to replace him. Bears also have an assistant DBs coach who coaches the safeties in Matt Giordano, who's a former safety himself. I remember him playing for the Colts and I think the Raiders for a little while in there. He was an assistant secondaries coach with defensive coordinator Dennis Allen on the New Orleans Saints before he came to the Bears this season. So he could be somebody who gets internally promoted to the role. But if they want to go from someone maybe outside the organization, maybe with a little bit more experience by comparison, some names out there to like that have been successful and have a lot of experience under the belt that you could potentially plug and play into that role if they're interested and if Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen are interested. One of the interesting things that I'd like to point out here briefly is that I wonder if Aaron Glenn had been fired by the New York Jets, he might have been a candidate for this role, because you might not know, before Aaron Glenn was the Lions defensive coordinator, he was the defensive backs coach on the New Orleans Saints under defensive coordinator Dennis Allen. So if he were available, he would make a lot of sense as both someone that Ben Johnson knows and someone that Dennis Allen has worked with directly in that defensive backs role. But through Aaron Glenn, you have some connections to some other guys as well. Like, for example, the current Jets assistant defensive backs coach, a name that would be intriguing for me, is Dre Bly, who was also the Lions cornerbacks coach in 2023. So he's worked with Ben Johnson, he's worked with Aaron Glenn in multiple spots, and he kind of fits that Al Harris young former player with a little bit of juice and energy on the sideline. If you remember Dre Bly as the former Lions and Broncos cornerback, those are the two teams I associate the most with him. I think he may have played for the Rams a little bit in there too, but like he was someone who was not afraid to be a vocal cornerback on the field, a multi-time Pro Bowler, someone who knows the position through and through and could be that similar type of voice to connect with the defensive backs the way Al Harris did. But he doesn't have a lot of experience. He's been an NFL coach really for like 2 full seasons. So maybe they want somebody a little more experienced. You could look at somebody like Chris Richard, who was, you might remember him as the Seattle Seahawks defensive coordinator when they won the Super Bowl. But he spent a couple seasons as a DB coach for the Cowboys with, I think Al Harris was on staff at that point, and with Dennis Allen on the New Orleans Saints for 2 seasons. He was actually out of the NFL this past season, was not on a coaching staff, but he had been the Jaguars defensive backs coach most recently before this. He would be a name that I think could make a lot of sense plugging in there. Or if you really want to go like experienced older guy, there's 2 coaches on the Raiders coaching staff that are going to be available now that worked with Dennis Allen in New Orleans. One is Joe Woods, who was previously Dennis Allen's defensive coordinator with the Saints, has been defensive coordinator for the Browns and the Broncos at different points throughout his career. He's been around the NFL for 20 years as a defensive backs coach and defensive coordinator. Obviously, this last season with the Raiders, nothing to write home about, but familiarity with this coaching staff, a bunch of experience, and has run defenses of his own. I think someone like Joe Woods would make a lot of sense, as would Marcus Robertson, who is also on the Raiders coaching staff, also coached with Dennis Allen on the Saints as defensive backs coaches. Currently, the Raiders DBs coach was the Saints DBs coach before that. So familiarity, experience, veteran presence that can kind of plug and play, and you'd feel like you're getting a guy that can help out your staff. I'd throw in Brian Duker, the Miami Dolphins' passing game coordinator and secondary coach. He too has some experience with these guys from Detroit when he was a defensive backs coach there. Any of those names would make a lot of sense. Or Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen might pull somebody from left field that we've never heard of before or didn't guess would be coming to the position. No matter what they do, we're going to break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And just because we're in the offseason doesn't mean we're slowing down anytime soon. We're still going to be here 5 days a week, all throughout free agency, the draft, and beyond. And before you know it, we'll be getting ready for training camp and back on the horse. But in the meantime, I hope that you've enjoyed this fun season, you're excited for the offseason to follow, and you keep tuning into Locked On Bears for your next opportunity to bear down.